occasionally awkwardly, but genuinely. He has, in her assessment, become a better father than he was a husband, which is an outcome that serves the children and which she acknowledges without pretending it removes the sting of why it became necessary. He has not, to her knowledge, not been consistently faithful in subsequent relationships. This is not her problem, it is his. She understands the difference. There is a question that underlies every story of betrayal, every documentary that examines the collapse of trust between people who loved each other, and it is a question that Caroline herself has spent 4 years circling. It is not the question most people think it is when they first encounter a story like this. The question most people lead with is, how could they do this? Which is understandable and human, but which is ultimately not the most important question. The most important question, the one that changes things when you actually grapple with it, is, what does it mean to truly know another person? Because what Caroline discovered, what most people in her situation discover when they have the courage to look at it squarely, is that the story she was living was real. The love she felt was real. The memories she made were real. The man who got down on one knee at a waterfall was real. The friend who answered at 2 a.m. was real. These things were not retroactively fake because of what happened later. What happened later was also real. Both things were real. And the coexistence of those two realities, the genuine and the false inhabiting the same lives simultaneously, is one of the most disorienting things a human being can encounter. We tend to think about people as consistent. We tend to assume that if someone loves you, they love you completely and exclusively, and with a faithfulness that extends to all the dimensions of how they treat you. When we tend to assume that the person who shows up for you in your worst moment is the same person in every moment. We extend to the people we love a coherence, a unity of self that is actually, when you examine it closely, far more complex than we allow. People are not a single thing. They are not a villain or a hero, a good person or a bad person, loving or deceitful. They are all of these things in varying proportions at varying times. And the painful truth that stories like Caroline's illuminate is that the capacity for love and the capacity for harm are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist in the same person, in the same relationship, across the same years. This does not excuse, it does not justify, it does not soften what was done or reduce its cost, but it does expand the frame through which we understand what happened. And expanding the frame, while it does not make the hurt go away, gives us more room to breathe within our own story. It allows us to grieve more fully because we are grieving something real rather than something we have decided was never real. And it allows us to carry the experience without it becoming the totality of who we are and what we know. Dr. Owens told Caroline early in their work together that the goal of therapy was not to get back to who she was before. That person was not coming back, and the wish to return to her was the wish to undo learning, which was not something any amount of therapeutic work could or should accomplish. The goal was to become, through the experience and in spite of it, someone who could live more fully in the truth of her own life, whatever that life turned out to look like. Caroline holds on to that. She holds on to it not because it resolves the grief, but because it gives the grief a purpose, which is different from a resolution and possibly more useful. The purpose of the grief was to change her, not to diminish her or define her by what she lost, but to excavate something underneath the loss that had always been there and had never had sufficient occasion to become fully visible. A resilience, a clarity, a capacity for being alone without being lonely, a knowledge of what she was made of that only comes from being tested in the way she was tested. She is not grateful for what happened. She wants to be clear about that because she has heard people say about their own experiences of devastating loss that they are grateful for it, and she respects that if it is genuinely true for them, but she cannot say it for herself without feeling like she is performing a graciousness she doesn't actually feel. She is not grateful for the years of deception. She is not grateful for the loss of her best friend, or the end of her marriage, or the night she sat in a cooling bathtub and cried until she was empty. She is not grateful for the look on Ethan's face the first time he had to say goodbye to his father at the door and walk back into the house that no longer had his father in it. What she is more herself than she has ever been, genuinely, measurably, demonstrably more fully herself, more honest about what she needs and less willing to compromise it in the service of keeping the peace, more able to sit with uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it, more comfortable with the complexity of people, including her own. I'm less afraid of the things she used to be most afraid of, including the specific fear of being alone, which turned out to be a fear of a thing that was not actually as terrible as she had imagined it. She is, in the most accurate and least performative sense of the word, okay? Not okay because everything is resolved or finished or healed in any neat and final sense, but okay because she is here. She is present. She is raising two extraordinary children and running a business she is proud of and growing things in a garden. She built herself and running 3 mornings a week and going to therapy when she needs it and calling her mother every Sunday and living fully and with intention the life that the woman who got a flash drive at a pharmacy 2 towns over and saved the copies of the emails and set the fork down on the table, when the woman who refused to pretend she didn't know what she knew worked to make possible. Before we continue to the final chapter of this story, we want to take a moment to ground what we have been telling you in a broader context, because Caroline's story, while deeply personal and irreducibly hers, is also, as we said earlier, not unique. It is part of a pattern, a phenomenon, that researchers and therapists have been studying and documenting for years, and what they have found is both sobering and, in certain ways, instructive. Studies on infidelity suggest that affairs involving close friends of the betrayed spouse are among the most psychologically damaging forms of relational betrayal, not because they are more common, but because they are more comprehensive in their impact. They don't just break the primary relationship, but they break the social architecture around it, the support network, the shared community, the collective memories. They leave the betrayed person without the infrastructure that healing would ordinarily require. Researchers who study what they call betrayal trauma have documented that the experience of discovering infidelity with a close friend tends to produce outcomes more closely resembling post-traumatic stress disorder than ordinary grief. The intrusive thoughts, the hypervigilance, the difficulty trusting perception, the disruption of the sense of safety in the world, these are not simply sadness or anger, though they include both. They are symptoms of a fundamental disruption in the person's ability to organize their experience around a stable, reliable sense of who is trustworthy and what is real. This has implications for healing that extend well beyond the ordinary grief timeline that most people, and indeed most professionals, would apply to a divorce. People who have experienced this type of betrayal often report that the emotional recovery takes significantly longer than the legal and logistical recovery, that friends and family who are supportive in the immediate aftermath often pull back or become impatient at a point when the deeper work is only just beginning. This mismatch between the social expectation of recovery and the actual timeline of recovery is itself a source of suffering, because it creates a loneliness at precisely the moment when the most difficult healing work is being done. The literature on double betrayal, as it has come to be called by practitioners, one also documents a consistent pattern in how the betrayed person relates to their own past. There is an almost universal experience of having to rewrite a significant portion of one's own history, of going back through memories that were previously positive, and having to sit with the knowledge that at least some of what you believed was happening in those moments was not in fact what was happening. This cognitive and emotional task is one of the most exhausting aspects of the recovery process, because it is not something that happens once in a single session of reflection, but rather in an ongoing, recurring, unpredictable way as the mind continues to process the implications of what was learned. What the research also shows, however, and this is the part that matters for the people who are living through something like what Caroline lived through, is that outcomes are genuinely variable, that a significant portion of people who have survived this type of betrayal report at various points after the acute phase, levels of self-understanding, relational clarity, and life satisfaction that are not lower than before the betrayal and are in some cases higher. Not because the betrayal was good, but because the work it forced them to do was the work they needed to do. Because the destruction of a particular architecture, however painful, created the space for a different and in some ways more honest one. This is not a guarantee. It is not a formula. There are people who go through this and do not arrive at that place, all right, who carry the damage in ways that continue to limit their lives for years and decades, and who would benefit from more support and more sustained intervention than they typically receive. The outcomes are better when people have access to skilled therapy, to genuine community support, and to a sufficient amount of time, all three of which are not equally distributed across the population of people who need them. But the potential for transformation through this kind of loss is real. It is documented. It is something that the people who work most closely with survivors of betrayal see with enough regularity to say with confidence that it is not an aberration or an idealistic fantasy, but an actual achievable outcome for people who are willing to do the work and who have enough support to sustain them through the doing of it. Caroline is one of those people. She is also clear that she is not special in the sense of having had access to some quality that others lack. She is special in the sense that every person is special, that her particular configuration of strengths and history and the specific people who showed up for her gave her a path through something that could have ended differently. She does not take credit for surviving it in a way that implies that other people who are struggling simply lack her character. She knows better than that. She has sat in enough online forums and community groups and quiet conversations with other women going through similar things to know that character has very little to do with who survives intact and who doesn't. What matters is what you have around you, who shows up, whether there is enough of a floor to stand on while the ceiling is gone. There is one final chapter of this story that we have not yet told, one last thread that did not resolve itself neatly and which is, in its unresolved nature, possibly the most true part of what we have to say. A year and a half after Caroline told Renee she knew and hung up the phone, Renee sent a letter. Not an email, a handwritten letter, the kind that requires intention and commitment in a way that typing does not. The kind where you cannot delete a sentence once it is on the page. It arrived in a white envelope with no return address, though Caroline knew immediately who it was from before she opened it. She recognized the handwriting. She had been reading it since she was 12 years old. She almost didn't open it. But she stood at the kitchen counter with the envelope in her hand for a long time, long enough that Grace came into the kitchen and asked what she was holding, and she said just a letter. And Grace went back to what she was doing, and Caroline continued to stand there. She opened it. The letter was 4 pages long. She will not share what was in it, and we are not going to speculate or reconstruct it. What she has said, carefully and in the privacy of conversations with people she trusts, is that it was not what she expected. It was not self-justifying in the way she had braced for. It was not an explanation dressed as an apology. It was, as best as she could assess it, an honest attempt at something she didn't have a word for. Not a request for forgiveness, not an expectation of response. Just an attempt to put into language, and after a year and a half of silence, something about the weight of what had been done and the impossibility of undoing it, and the knowledge that the damage was real and permanent and deserved. She read it 3 times. Then she put it in a drawer. Then she took it out and read it again. Then she put it in a different drawer, the one in her bedside table that contains the things she keeps that are too important to throw away and too private to put anywhere anyone might accidentally encounter. She did not respond to the letter, not because she had nothing to say and not because she lacked the courage, but because she spent several months of careful reflection and several sessions with Dr. Owens deciding what, if any, response would serve her own life. And what she arrived at was the conclusion that there was nothing she needed to say in return. The letter asked for nothing. It expected nothing. It had delivered something that she had processed and placed and was not going to pretend she had received differently than she had. And beyond that, there was nothing that could be said to Renee that Renee did not already know. Everything true that could be communicated between them had already been communicated in one direction or another over the years and through the events that had brought them to this point. This is a conclusion that may be unsatisfying to some people who hear this story. Some people would want the reconciliation. Some people would want the scene of 2 women sitting across a table from each other and doing the painful, unnecessary work of becoming something new out of the rubble of what they had been. And it is not the job of this story to tell you that such a thing is impossible or even inadvisable. For some people, that work is the right work. For Caroline, at this point in her life, it is not the right work. Not because the history between them has no value, but because the act of trying to restore something that was destroyed in a particular and irreversible way would require her to pretend a confidence in Renee's trustworthiness that she does not have, and she is honest about this, does not expect to have. And she has decided that she does not owe anyone the performance of a trust she doesn't feel. She wishes Renee well. She said this to Dr. When Owens, and she has said it to the people closest to her in a way that they received as genuine and not performative. And they knew her well enough to know the difference. She does not wish Renee harm. She does not carry hatred, though there were periods in the first year when she did, and she gave herself permission to feel it fully and did not pretend it wasn't there, because it was there and it was legitimate and it deserved to be felt. But she does not feel it now. What she feels when she allows herself to go to that place at all is closer to a vast and complicated sadness. The kind you feel when something that was real and important ends not through any natural process of change, but through a specific and catastrophic failure of the people involved to honor it. Renee and Curtis divorced about a year after everything came out, or this is something that Caroline learned from a mutual acquaintance, and which she received with a quietness that surprised even her. She did not feel vindicated by it. She felt very briefly a pulse of something that might have been grief for Curtis, who had been an innocent party in all of this in a way that she had thought about more than she let on. And then she let it go, because it was not her story to carry. We want to end where we began, not at the party, earlier than the party, back in a 7th grade classroom in Columbus, Ohio, on a Tuesday in October, when a girl who had just moved to a new school sat down in the only empty seat in homeroom and found herself next to someone who was reading the same book she had just finished reading. That moment was real. Whatever happened afterward, whatever choices were made in the years that followed, that corroded and ultimately destroyed what grew from that moment, the moment itself was real. The friendship that began there was real. The love that was built in that friendship, the 2 a.m. phone calls, the hospital waiting room, the wedding, the kitchen table coffees, all of it was real. It was built by 2 real people who genuinely loved each other. And then one of those people made a series of choices that destroyed it. This is the truth that stories like this require us to hold. And it is the hardest truth of all. Not the comfortable truth that evil is something that happens to us from the outside, that the people who hurt us were always the kind of people who would hurt us, that we simply failed to see their true nature. That story is more comfortable because it is simpler. It gives us a clear villain and a clear lesson. Stay away from people like that. The more complicated and accurate truth is that the people who hurt us most profoundly are often the people who also loved us most genuinely, and that the coexistence of those 2 things, the love and the harm, the genuine and the false, is not a contradiction to be resolved, but a reality to be lived with. That people are capable of loving us and failing us simultaneously. That the failure does not erase the love, and the love does not excuse the failure. That both of these things can be true about the same person in the same relationship, and that we can hold both truths without collapsing either of them. This is not an easier story to tell than the simple one. It is, in fact, much harder. It asks more of the person living it and more of the people who hear it. It requires a tolerance for complexity and a willingness to sit with things that do not resolve neatly. But it is the true story. And true stories, even when they are painful, are the ones that ultimately help us more, because they reflect the actual territory of human life rather than a simplified map of it, and it is the actual territory we are navigating every day with the people we love. Caroline Mitchell is 42 years old. She woke up this morning, as she wakes up most mornings now, at 6:30. She made coffee. She stood at her kitchen window and watched the light come in over the backyard garden that she planted and tends herself. She had a design meeting at 9. She picked Grace up from school at 3:15 and sat at the kitchen table while Grace did homework and asked her questions about fractions, which Caroline answered with the patience that is her particular gift. She texted her mother and her sister. She had dinner with a friend she has known since her design school days. Not Renee, a different friend, a newer friend, A friend who knows the full story and loves her anyway, which is perhaps the only kind of friendship that means what it means. She is, as her mother told her she would be, okay. She is more than okay. She is, in the specific and hard-won and deeply earned sense of the word, herself. And that, after everything, is the most important thing of all. Before we wrap up, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would truly love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one, stories about real people, real choices, and what it means to rebuild a life from the foundation up are what we do here. And there are many more to come. If this story moved you, if something in it reflected an experience you've had or someone you love has had, please share it. Not because we're asking you to share it for us, but because stories that tell the truth about the hardest parts of being human are the ones that reach the people who most need to hear them. And somewhere right now, there is someone standing at a kitchen counter holding an envelope they are not sure they should open. Or sitting in a cooling bathtub at the end of the worst night of their life, or lying in the dark at 2 a.m. with a grief that has no name and no clear end. And they need to know that what they are going through is survivable, more than survivable. That the person they will be on the other side of it, if they do the work and let people in and tell the truth, even when it's terrifying, is someone worth becoming. Caroline knows this. She is living it one morning, one cup of coffee, one October light through a kitchen window at a time. Thank you for watching.